Hello, my name is Sarah Margolis-Pineo. I am an associate at John Keith Russell Antiques in South Salem, New York, specializing in shaker, as well as an independent curator and writer specializing in American craft and design. This talk was presented in collaboration with Fruitlands Museum in Harvard, Massachusetts, in conjunction with the exhibition Unseen Hours by Maria Molteni and Allison Halter, on view at the museum September 15, 2021 through March 13, 2022. What you're seeing is a video clip from their collaborative performance and video installation, Sacred Sheets. Before I begin, I have to address the fact that the era of manifestations is an undeniably enthralling period in Shaker history. There are spirit visitations, ghosts speaking through mediums, elaborate midnight rituals. It's all so riveting, and Hollywood can't even make this stuff up. That said, I'd like to start by echoing the sentiments of Brother Arnold Todd, who is one of the practicing Shakers in the community up in Sabbath Day Lake, Maine. Yes, there is a small community of Shakers still living and practicing up there. Brother Arnold reminds us that the era of manifestations was a short-lived period in the ongoing history of the Shakers, a history that dates back to 1747. This means that Shaker history spans 275 years and counting, and the era of manifestations is a mere decade within that span, from about 1837 to about 1850 or so. So please keep in mind that Shaker belief and spiritual practice continues to evolve like all of our religions. But with that due diligence out of the way, we will talk about the era of manifestations. It all started on August 16, 1837, when a group of young girls of the Second and South families of the Watervliet Shaker community experienced visionary messages from the spirit world. Brother Isaac Newton Young's scribe of the New Lebanon community documented that, quote, "The windows of heaven and the avenues of the spirit world were set open, and innumerable gifts were showered down of visions, revelations, inspiration, messages from spirits, spiritual presence, and new songs in profusion. The girls' frenzied bodily contortions, these powerful shakings and quakings, were accompanied by supernatural prophecies, trances, revelations, visions, songs, and dances. Word of these celestial gifts traveled swiftly, and more mediums from other Shaker settlements, who the Shakers called visionists or instruments, relayed a barrage of communications from various deities watching over the Shaker world. In addition to communicating with angels, the Shakers spoke to, quote, spirit converts, indigenous Native American spirits, or other primitive peoples, deceased family members, and noted historical figures, all of whom converted to Shakerism in the spirit world. George Washington, General Lafayette, William Penn, Pope Clement VIII, and the kings and queens of Europe, among others, relayed stories of their quote unquote sufferings in the afterlife until they heeded the Shaker message and found salvation. Shaker founding era luminaries visited as well, including Mother Lucy, Father William, Father Joseph, and of course, Anne Lee herself, to reassert the theological foundations of the faith. Prophesying, shaking, bowing, and singing in unknown tongues became the norm at Shaker meetings. This outpouring of visions led to the creation of thousands of Shaker songs, new dances, rituals, and visual art in the form of gift drawings. Eventually termed the era of manifestations or mother's work, this period of intense spiritual fervor, which in many ways echoed the origins of the faith in the time of Anne Lee, continued well into the next decade, until about 1845 to 1850, when the broader American spiritualist movement was just getting started. First, a bit of background on the Shakers. The United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, more commonly known as the Shakers, traced their roots to Manchester, England in 1747. Ex-Quakers James and Jane Wardley founded the Wardley Society. In 1858, Anne Lee, an illiterate woman working in a Manchester factory, found spiritual refuge with the Wardleys. She proved to be a passionate visionary, a conduit of God who shook, trembled, danced, sang, and spoke in unknown tongues under his power. Soon, Lee's intense spiritual revelations regarding the fall of Adam and Eve and her own role as the second coming of Christ anointed her Mother Ann, leader of the Shakers. In 1774, she was able to mobilize a small group of 8 followers to immigrate to the United States in pursuit of religious freedom. Interestingly, the Wardleys were not among the 8. After landing in New York City, the Shakers settled just outside of Albany in 1776 in a place called Niskayuna, later Watervliet, and they quietly began to set down roots, working to make money so they could establish themselves as a separate community, a place to freely worship. The Shakers came to America at a time when people were casting about for something new to believe in. Shifting economic, social, and intellectual power structures created unbearable tensions in the lives of ordinary folk. And in order to alleviate these anxieties, they demanded comfort from spiritual sources. Curiously, not from the empirical evidence fueled by enlightenment, but rather from immediate experience with God. The spiritual revivalists of the Great Awakening flourished, and the time for Anne Lee's evangelical message of salvation flourished. 2, the political climate of the American Revolution worked in Anne Lee's favor. Although the Shakers were noted and sometimes persecuted pacifists, the revolution embraced the spirit of a new beginning for the world, a secular second coming. It was enthusiastic and religious in spirit and echoed the Shakers' millennialist beliefs. Like Lee's desire to start a new, sinless, more holy society from scratch, revolutionaries sought a radical new national reality in which individual rights and freedoms and the pursuit of happiness would be the norm. As a result, Mother Ann was able to draw a number of converts from Protestant and Baptist congregations. In the 18th century, Lee's primary objective was to assemble a spiritual community. Her ministry did not outline a dogmatic theology that translated into a set of earthly practices, but she did establish certain themes that would form the basis of Shakerism: celibacy, dual Godhead, obedience, confession of sin, manifestations of spirit, perfection, etc., etc. The prime architect of Shakerism, as it is known and practiced today, was the first American-born leader of the sect, Father Joseph Meacham. He was appointed father following the death of James Whitaker in 1787, who had assumed leadership of the sect after the death of Mother Ann Lee in 1784. According to Shaker biographer Calvin Green, Meacham was approximately 6 feet tall, slim, with broad shoulders, bluish-gray eyes, dark brown hair, and a rather dark complexion. He was long-limbed and graceful and presented an overall appearance that inspired confidence and struck beholders with reverential awe. Meacham was also gentle, affable, reserved, inflexible in his duty, and endowed with a wisdom that was remarkable. According to Green, he was a powerful and very discerning speaker whose voice when he spoke, quote, sounded like peals of thunder, and his eyes appeared like flames of fire, so that it seemed they would penetrate the innermost recesses of the heart. Mother Ann referred to Meacham as the wisest man to be born in hundreds of years, and lending truth to her pronouncement, he implemented measures that helped the Shakers to create the longest standing utopian experiment in American history. Masterfully, Father Joseph was able to organize Mother Ann's charismatic spiritual revelations into a coherent theological framework that lent a sense of stability as a new generation of Shaker was brought into the fold. He recognized that theology and its practical application should pervade all aspects of everyday life as a way of mirroring the embodied spiritual reality. To this end, he developed a society in which every aspect, the material landscape, routine daily functioning, social life were bound to theological practice. Notably, Father Joseph instituted hierarchies of governance, both spiritual and temporal, that allowed the entire Shaker diaspora to thrive together in union. He appointed Mother Lucy Wright, his female counterpart, thereby establishing gender equality within Shaker governance. He designed the landscape of the Shaker village to be a model of utility, simplicity, and harmony, a visual embodiment of the community's social and spiritual removal from the quote-unquote world. And ultimately, Meacham mobilized disparate groupings of believers into organized communities that by the time he died in 1796, included 11 societies across 5 states. Father Joseph's lasting importance to the Shakers cannot be understated. Meacham was the important link between the original English cohort and the American converts, and he codified a grand plan for Shaker life, belief, and leadership that is still in practice today. By the first decades of the 19th century, Shaker society was living up to Meacham's vision. Daily life was dictated by the toll of a bell. Shaker design was codified and replicated across the diaspora, from the landscape and architecture to the furniture, clothing, and domestic objects used therein. Worship services or meetings consisted of scripted dance and song, opposed to ecstatic expressions of the founding generation. And the Shakers labored hard in worship as well as work. The Shaker industries, the seeds, the agricultural products, the medicines, furniture, woodenware, etc., were immensely productive and supported a thriving economy. In 1821, the Shaker precepts were printed in a volume called the Millennial Laws, and by and large, the Shakers were obedient and life was good, if not entirely sinless. Food, clothing, and shelter were all in abundance, and for many decades, the villages were havens for pilgrims seeking a new way of life. Even so, in the early 19th century, the population began to decline. Admittedly, recruitment was challenging. Joining the Shakers meant giving up all property, family, and sex. And for many young Shakers brought into the community as children, they began to defect. They would apostatize to employ their superlative Shaker educations and skills in the service of the capitalist marketplace and burgeoning industrial sector. To reinvigorate and hopefully retain the younger generation, the Shakers looked inward, seeking inspiration from their own history. They published the testimonies of the life, character, revelations, and doctrines of our ever-blessed mother, Anne Lee, and the elders with her. And you can see there's more to the title there. A text that gathered and recorded the recollections of older believers, those, quote, eye and ear witnesses who had known Mother Anne and the first elders and could provide a detailed account of their lives and accomplishments. Laid out chapter and verse, the testimonies begins with the birth and spiritual blossoming of Mother Anne Lee and continues with her missionary travels through New England. It provides examples of the manifestations of God in Mother, instructions in spiritual and temporal affairs, and precepts under which these groups were eventually drawn into communities of believers. The intent of the stories of the testimonies is to disseminate an intimate knowledge of Anne Lee and her cohort of founders so that all believers, both novice and experienced, may feel a deeper connection to the church. Did this revisitation of the life, work, and power of Mother Anne spark a renewed interest in charismatic communications with the spirit world that ultimately led to the activities of the era of manifestations? Was the appeal of Mother Anne and the spirit world compounded by an underlying resistance to the relative stasis of Shaker life? What else was at play leading up to the era of manifestations? Scholar Robert Orsi describes religion as a network of relationships between heaven and earth. In the early 19th century, the Second Great Awakening was underway in the Eastern US, which, like its first incarnation, ushered in a sense of renewed spiritual fervor, a Protestant revival. An aspect of the Second Great Awakening was a shifting relationship with death, perhaps a post-war phenomena as well, that reconfigured early American cultural views on the existence of invisible forces and the possibilities to engage unseen worlds. To the Shakers, the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds had always been blurred. Anne Lee claimed she could communicate with angels and the souls of the deceased, a tradition passed along to her believers. As the generation that had known Mother Anne personally passed away, the spirit world was once again the central focus of Shaker life. Gift drawings are among the only Shaker material artifacts that make this connection between the material and the spiritual explicit. Menageries of mystical flora and fauna, otherworldly symbols, and geometric blueprints resembling works of constructivist art are just some of the motifs found on the approximately 200 gift drawings held in public and private collections today. Like everything designed and made by the Shakers, these bewildering works of art represent correspondence between life and what exists beyond. They were messages collapsing the boundary between the corporal world and the celestial sphere. The windows of heaven were indeed thrown open, and gift drawings were portals to see beyond the visible. Hannah Cahoon created this gift drawing, The Tree of Life, at age 66. Her small group of visionary artworks are perhaps the best known Shaker gift drawings today. All use trees or fruit as a motif, an important symbol within many religious traditions for the connection to the Garden of Eden and the source of eternal life. Father Joseph drew on the tree as an allusion to Shaker unity. He famously said, "If it is so in the root, it must be so in the branches. And as the order is complete in the foundation, it must be so in the building." For Meacham, the tree was symbolic of the strength of the Shaker diaspora rooted in Mother Anne's legacy. Unlike automatic writings created in the throes of spirit possession, a Shaker gift drawing is a transcription of a vision recorded in the days after the spirit encounter. The artist of the visualization is not necessarily the instrument who received the message. Rather, they are more of a spiritual scribe, which is why many gift drawings are unattributed and instead labeled with the name of the spirit, the recipient of the gift, and the date the communication occurred. Broadly, Shaker gift drawings can be drawn into three categories: pictorial works, leaf and heart cutouts, and the sacred sheets. The pictorial works are illustrations of heavenly landscapes that embody the broader ideology of Shaker craft. They are meticulously designed with marks indicating that tools were used to mark out compositions, rendered in a spectrum of jewel-like tones, and every detail appears purposeful. This piece, in the collection of Fruitlands Museum in Harvard, Massachusetts, is by Sister Sarah Bates. Sister Sarah came to the Shakers of Watervliet when she was just 11 years old and later moved to Lebanon, New York. Her father, Issachar Bates, was a spiritual leader in the Shaker Church. He was one of the 9 missionaries sent west to gather new orders in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. 9, quote, sacred rolls are attributed to Sarah Bates. Detailed emblems illustrated here include a clock, trumpet, and 5 sacred trees belonging to Mother Anne, Father William, Father James, Father Joseph, and Mother Lucy. There's also fine script rendered in her school teacher's hand. In 1918, this piece was given to the founder of Fruitlands Museum, Clara Endicott Sears, by Eldris Kathleen Allen of the Mount Lebanon Shaker community. Many of the symbols found in Shaker gift drawings have real-world reference: icons from gravestones, Masonic symbols, celestial bodies, and quilting and embroidery motifs. Some works mash up the abstract symbology with physical materials from the Shaker world, as in this piece. This work is by New Lebanon Shaker Sister Miranda Barber, and in each corner you have 4 angels blowing the 4 horns of revelations. In the lower right, you have Mother Anne riding in a golden chariot, And above her in the center of the composition, you have a chair, tables, and a very shaker iron door latch, presumably on the door to heaven. The inscription reads, "So come sit down in the mansion of the blessed and go no more out." In the center of the piece is a yellow, all-seeing God's eye motif, which Sister Miranda, referred to as wisdom's holy seal. Our second group of gift drawings illustrated here are the leaf and heart cutouts and rewards of merit, which contain very little illustration, and instead, the diminutive, intimate drawings are enveloped in fine script. Eldridge Polly Jane Reed of New Lebanon created many of the existing cutouts for her peers in her community. Addressed to specific brethren and sisters, the messages are divine expressions of affection and esteem. Finally, our last group, the body of gift drawings, which were the inspiration for Maria Molteni and Allison Halter's performance and videos, are the sacred sheets. These pieces appear lively and strange, comprised of a chaotic jumble of curlicues, flourishes, and hash marks that bloom across the page. These artworks represent a spiritual lexicon occupying a liminal space between text and image. They evoke maps, fecund gardens, and musical notation that has broken free of its 5-line staff. Intentionally cryptic, the power of the sacred sheets comes from their mystery. They are wild, they are unknowable, and they can only be explained as the words of angels transcribed by human hands. Admittedly, there is not much known about the sacred sheets. Their history is not documented, well, in any documentation existent anyway, and their meaning can only be intuited from the form and the context in which they were created, in relation to the other gift drawings and manuscripts that are left behind. Curiously, there is a manuscript in the collection of Shaker Museum, Mount Lebanon, that dates to March 5, 1843, a Sunday, the very day that the sacred sheet was received by its instrument. The title, "The Holy Word of the Lord God Almighty," given at Wisdom's Valley and written by inspiration at the Holy Mount, indicates that the text itself and the instructions therein were initially received at Watervliet, New York, and then transcribed in New Lebanon, New York. During the era of manifestations, each Shaker community was given a spiritual name. Watervliet was Wisdom's Valley, and New Lebanon was Holy Mount. A PDF of the Holy Word is available on Mount Lebanon's online database, which is a fantastic resource. I haven't read it line by line. It's very dense with 19th century script, but I was able to decipher that on page 30 of the text, there is a reference to, quote, a new manner written, which no man knoweth. This may allude to the divination and later production of the mysterious writing on the sacred sheets. Additional documentation of the practice of unknowable text is in another manuscript in the collection of New York Public Library, dated just a few days prior, March 1, 1843. In it, the New Lebanon community scribes observe, quote, about this time and a few weeks past, there has been a remarkable manifestation from the spirits in writing certain mysterious sheets containing many hieroglyphics, an abundance of mysterious writing in unknown characters. They are said to contain much that will be revealed. The enigmatic nature of the sacred sheets seemed to capture the scribe's imagination here, and it's implied that the artworks had abundant meaning that was only knowable to the spirits and the instrument, meaning that would be revealed in the future, and meaning that could not be challenged. To the Shakers, the sheet seemingly had a prophetic power, a power that could be employed, modified, and reimagined as needed. At this point in the era of manifestations, it had been unfolding for more than 5 years. And as the spirit work progressed, the tension between gifts of inspiration and a need for order and uniformity, as introduced by Meacham, was increasingly at odds. Through 1841, the Visionists prevailed, and a cohort of predominantly young women held an unprecedented position within the strata of Shaker spiritual power. They upended previous hierarchies, new converts eclipsed elders, sporadic bodily expressions derailed established choreographies. Some Visionists employed their newfound spiritual authority to test the structures of Shaker society by using their gifts to reveal illicit improprieties, make false accusations, settle old scores, and generally manipulate their fellow believers. Hancock elder Barnabas Sprague admitted that, quote, "The elders have a hard time of it in this hurricane of gifts to know what is revelation and what is not." Eventually, the Shaker leadership reined the Visionists in. The ministry's approach to controlling the spiritual phenomena was twofold. Firstly, they employed Holy Mother Wisdom. Holy Mother Wisdom is the female aspect of the dual Godhead, and she made her first appearance in 1841. The ministry in New Lebanon, New York, planned Holy Mother Wisdom's visits well in advance and informed each Shaker community by letter of her impending arrival, giving precise dates and instructions. For example, Holy Mother Wisdom visited Harvard on July 25th, 1841. During her visit, her first act was to appoint instruments. She appointed 7 sisters and 5 brothers at Harvard to speak for her and to, quote, bear witness to her presence. In essence, the ministry began appointing instruments within every Shaker community. These were individuals selected from the church family who were able to stay on message, communicating revelations in obedience to and in union with the visible lead. Once designated, the instruments would will themselves to revelation by whirring, bowing, and writhing with their eyes closed to direct the mind with excessive energy at the attainment of gifts. By 1843, when the sacred sheets were produced, it can be assumed that most spirit manifesting was conducted by sanctioned instruments and vetted by the ministry. So the messaging served to support and develop Shaker theology rather than potentially destabilize it. Also from March of 1843, in the collection of Philadelphia Museum of Art, is a map, The Holy City, attributed to Polly Jane Reed. An accompanying manuscript describes how the spirit of Adam visited New Lebanon to provide the Shakers with a plan of heaven. Meticulously laid out and numbered, the geometry of the Holy City reinforces the established Shaker aesthetic, comprised of balanced squares, rectangles, and circles in a spectrum of traditional Shaker hues. Representing buildings, gardens, golden streets, walls, and the river of life, this intriguing civic plan can be read as a send-up from the ministry, a deliberate merging of ideology, Shaker aesthetics, and cosmic geography to reassert the truth of the Shaker endeavor. And with it is pictured a Shaker songbook that is dated also from March 16, 1843, also from New Lebanon, New York. And the notation is interesting there. It does truly resemble the flourishes of the sacred sheets. The second way the ministry sought to control the Shaker Visionists in the era of manifestations was by instituting rituals. The infamous mountain meetings held each May and September from 1842 to 1854 were rituals devised to be an exercise in unity. All believers were encouraged to participate as instruments and commune with the Shaker spirits in turn. Each Shaker community was instructed to clear a space adjacent to the village to use as a feast ground or holy hill. The site itself was chosen by an instrument under the direction of the spirits, and once cleared, the Shakers fenced the area in and constructed 2 small shelters, one for brethren, one for sisters, which you see here. In the center, they erected a fountain stone, a marble slab inscribed with ritual text. Shaker apostate David Lamson described, quote, "It is a fountain not of literal waters, but of the water of life, and is exceedingly productive of spiritual gifts. It serves also as a center around which they march, dance, sing, and play." Preparation for mountain meetings included fasting, confession of sins, prayer, and being dressed in spiritual garments by 2 angels. On the day of the celebration, the Shakers ascended the feast ground in procession, singing, bowing, and shouting. Arriving at the site, the ritual began with a blessing of instruments, followed by collective dancing, whirling, shaking, and ecstatic movements. Following the dance, instruments pantomimed figurative activities, including anointing with oil, washing feet, sowing and watering spiritual seeds, bestowing gifts, and sharing a bowl of young love and union. 2, they consumed a sumptuous feast while drinking spiritual wine, which caused spiritual inebriation. A gift drawing by Sister Hannah Cahoon entitled "A Bower of Mulberry Trees" depicts a long Shaker communal table on which a spiritual feast has been displayed. Illustrating a mountain meeting in the waning years of the era of manifestations, Cahoon's composition evokes the idea of a passage between worlds. Indeed, the bower functions as a gateway, a visual meeting of heaven and earth where the living spirits may come together to feast. Cahoon emphasizes this by offering 2 simultaneous perspectives on the scene: the forward-facing mortal view and the aerial God's eye view. Her inscription reads, "I saw it distinctly, the long white table standing under the bower with cakes and knives upon it." The capacity to imagine the world otherwise, whether building a village from the ground up or pulling back the sky to reveal the unseen, demonstrates the transformative power of the human imagination. The Shakers used imagination as a tool, inspiring creativity and innovation, cultivating unity and a sense of shared purpose, and eliciting intimacy with God. According to Canterbury elder Henry Clay Blinn, the visionist's simple message had become the blessing of thousands and has placed the heavens above them as a beautiful star of hope. The era of manifestations emerged from the tension between order and volatility, consistency and reinvention. Shaker gift drawings continue to be compelling for their embodiment of this very duality. They exert institutional order through establishing contact with more supernatural and unwieldy sources of faith. Much like Meacham's vision of the material landscape of Shaker Zion, gift drawings provided a window into the celestial realm, thereby mediating passage between heaven and earth. In a sense, the visionary artworks are blueprints, tools for the Shaker world to more closely resemble its heavenly archetype. By the mid-1840s, the ministry realized the power of the era of manifestations was waning, so it sought to strengthen its position by reissuing the Millennial Laws in 1845. Strict even for Shaker standards, the 1845 edition can be seen, as Brother Ted Johnson of Sabbath Day Lake wrote, quote, "Perhaps the final attempt of those most closely associated with the spirit manifestations to turn the tide of disinterest and distrust which was making itself so evident. Like most rearguard actions, it seems to have proved to have been a highly unsuccessful attempt at redeeming a lost cause." In 1846, Sister Mary Wicks, an instrument and one of the accredited artists of the Sacred Sheets, apostatized, leaving the New Lebanon community with her future husband, Brother D.M. Bennett, an herbalist and community scribe, who went on to become one of the most prominent freethinkers of the late 19th century. Together, Bennett and Wicks established the publication, The Truth Seeker, dedicated to, quote, "science, morals, free thought, free discussions, liberalism, sexual equality, labor reform, progression, free education, and whatever tends to elevate and emancipate the human race. The Bennets sought to promote reason over superstition, humanity over false theologies, provoking readers to divest themselves from concepts of a vengeful God and the God-anointed rulers of humankind. In his memoir, Bennet wrote that he, quote, regards the worship and adoration that has been bestowed upon an imaginary, unknown being somewhere above the stars as labor thrown away. Such a being can neither be beneficial nor injured by anything that we can possibly do. Like the sun, he is entirely beyond our reach or influence. If all of the emotional fervor and worship that has been bestowed upon this unknown deity could have been directed towards humanity, to beings who really have an existence and are susceptible of being benefited by the services of others, the world would have been vastly better off. Given their history with the Shakers, it's impossible to separate the Bennets' desire to seek other kinds of truth from their dogmatic upbringing and, moreover, active participation in the era of manifestations and its effects. In 1847, when the Fox sisters in Rochester first started experiencing their spirit rappings, the Shakers were intrigued, and many thought it might lead to a new influx of believers. They followed mainstream spiritualism, even inviting spiritualists and mediums to give talks at Shaker villages. But by that point, the era of manifestations was largely over, even though gift drawings continued to be produced until the mid-1850s. Gifts of spirit inspired the Shaker collective imaginary, reinvigorating faith through expressions of the extraordinary. Authentic or not, Shaker visions reaffirmed Mother Anne's place at the center of the spirit world and as a tangible presence within the community. There was more space to reflect on the contributions of Mothers Anne and Lucy within the society's traditions. By the mid-19th century, the specters of the era of manifestations had faded and the feast ground had returned to wildness. Even so, the legacy of Mother's work lives on. Through the creativity of contemporary artists, we can again put on spiritual spectacles, release our imaginations, and feast with angels. Thank you.